They say that in the military, the most dangerous weapon isn't a nuclear warhead. It's a commander with a map, a high-speed internet connection, and a total lack of imagination. In the suffocating artificial silence of the Alexandria Federal Courthouse, Room 402 had been transformed into a strategic kill zone for a living legend. Chief Petty Officer Hannah Jameson, the Navy's most lethal ghost, wasn't standing before a jury. She was being buried alive by the same system she had bled to protect. The sharp metallic clink of heavy steel restraints shattered the courtroom air like a sniper's stray bullet. To the public, she was a disgraced rogue assassin. To the CIA, she was a loose end to be snipped. But as the judge raised his gavel to seal her fate, the heavy oak doors blasted open. A four-star admiral strode in, bringing with him a presidential override that would prove that while politicians write the laws, the truth is always written in the blood of the soldier on the ground. The air inside the courtroom was a sharp, stagnant chill, the kind of artificial cold that felt like a slap against the skin, reminding you that you were no longer in the real world. It was a world of glowing mahogany, whispering journalists, and the heavy, cloying scent of old paper and expensive perfume. Here, in the heart of Virginia, the war wasn't fought with Macmillan TAC 338 rifles, ballistic calculators, or ghillie suits. It was fought with redacted documents, character assassination, and vertical logic, the dangerous high-altitude belief that those at the top of the map know more than the soldier with boots in the mud. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder, Pentagon brass with rigid spines and CIA operatives in suits that cost more than a chief petty officer made in a year sat in the shadows. They weren't here for justice. They were here for a funeral of a reputation. Chief Petty Officer Hannah Jameson was led into the chamber by two armed U.S. Marshals who looked more like prison guards than brothers in arms. She was dressed in her Navy service dress whites, the ICE uniform, immaculately pressed, every crease sharp enough to cut. But the uniform was a hollow shell. Every warfare device that defined her soul had been ripped away by a bureaucratic order. The trident, the golden bird she had nearly died to earn in the freezing surf of Coronado, was gone. The bronze star with valor was gone. The purple heart from the Nasiriyah ambush was gone. In their place rested the cold, unforgiving steel of federal restraints, a belly band locking her wrists at her waist, and thick iron cuffs forcing her into short, agonizingly slow steps. It was a tactical display of dominance, a psychological operation designed to make a Tier 1 operator look like a caged predator in front of a civilian jury who had never heard a shot fired in anger. "The defendant is not a hero," boomed Assistant U.S. Attorney David Caldwell, his voice echoing with the rehearsed authority of a man who spent more time in a gym than in a combat zone. "She is a malfunction, a rogue element who decided that her own internal moral compass was more important than the sacred chain of command that holds this republic together." Hannah didn't flinch. She sat in the defense chair, her back as straight as a spear, her eyes, the piercing color of winter ice, scanning the room with the mechanical detachment of a sniper assessing a high-threat environment. She wasn't seeing the prosecutor. She was seeing the ghosts of history. She was seeing the same institutional arrogance that led to the massacre at Dien Bien Phu in 1953. Back then, the French Expeditionary Corps built a base in a valley, convinced that the primitive Viet Minh couldn't possibly haul heavy artillery over the mountains. They sat in their bunkers, drinking wine and reading maps, while the enemy dismantled them from the high ground they said didn't exist. Hannah realized that Room 402 was her Dien Bien Phu. The mountains were made of classified folders, and the enemy was wearing silk ties. Her mind drifted back to the Syrian border, 88 days ago. The sun over Al-Raqqa was a white-hot hammer against the skull, and the air smelled of cordite, diesel, and ancient dust. Operation Blackbird was supposed to be a routine extraction of a high-value asset, The CIA's golden boy, Tariq al-Hassan, was supposed to be the key to dismantling a sleeper cell. But as Hannah lay on a crumbling rooftop, her heart rate hovering at a steady 45 beats per minute, her optic told a different story. Through the Schmidt-Bender glass of her rifle, she didn't see an asset providing intel. She saw a traitor setting a trap. She saw al-Hassan directing armed insurgents into L-shaped ambush positions along the extraction route. She saw him personally burying the command wire for a daisy chain of IEDs exactly where her team's MRAPs would be forced to stop. It was the Nasiriyah mistake all over again, sending a convoy into a kill box because the people at HQ refused to believe their source was compromised. Narrative note: in Nasiriyah, 2003, the 507th Maintenance Company was decimated because they took a wrong turn into a pre-planned kill zone. The commanders at the top refused to believe the satellite images were showing an ambush. Hannah was seeing the exact same pattern through her scope. The CIA's vertical logic was blind to the horizontal truth on the ground. "Command, this is Outlaw 1. She had whispered into her comms, her voice a calm contrast to the chaos she was witnessing. "Asset is compromised. Repeat, al-Hassan is setting an ambush, requesting immediate neutralization. Permission to engage." The reply from the Tactical Operations Center, the TOC, came back 10 seconds later, crackling with the static of 500 miles of distance. "Negative, Outlaw 1. You are misidentifying the situation. Our intel confirms al-Hassan is securing the perimeter. Do not engage. That is a direct order from the director. Maintain observation only." In that heartbeat, the vertical logic of the system collided with the horizontal reality of the ground. Hannah knew that if she followed that order, 8 SEALs, her brothers, men she had bled with from the Hindu Kush to the Horn of Africa, would be vaporized in a ball of fire within minutes. She looked at the trigger. She looked at the target. She chose the lives of her team over the career of a handler. She adjusted for the 3-knot crosswind, held her breath at the bottom of the exhale, and sent a single 300-grain round through the traitor's chest. Now in the courtroom, that single shot was being called premeditated treason. Judge Arthur Pendleton, a man whose skin looked like yellowed parchment, leaned over his bench. He looked at Hannah with a mixture of disgust and boredom. "Given the defendant's history of specialized training," the judge rasped, "this court deems her a maximum escape risk. Marshals, secure the secondary restraints." The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the marshals looped a heavy steel cable through Hannah's waist chain and bolted it directly to a ring bolt in the floor. The clink, clink, clink of the metal echoed like a funeral knell. They were anchoring her like a ship to be scrapped. Caldwell smiled, a thin, oily expression of victory. He had the redacted drone footage that showed the shot but hid the IEDs. He had the missing radio transcripts. He had the high ground. But then, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 5 degrees. A muffled commotion erupted in the marble hallway outside, the sound of heavy, polished boots striking the floor in a synchronized rhythm that didn't belong to the civilian world. The 2 marshals at the doors reached for their sidearms, their eyes widening. The heavy oak doors didn't just open, they were hit with the force of a breaching charge. They slammed against the walls with a concussive boom that made the jury jump from their seats. Through the dust motes and the glare of the overhead lights strode Admiral Robert Bull Gallagher, commander of USSOCOM. He was a mountain of a man in pristine navy dress blues, his chest a solid wall of ribbons that told the story of 50 years of American conflict. He wasn't alone. Flanking him were the survivors of Bravo Platoon, the very men Hannah had saved, standing in their uniforms, their faces scarred and their eyes burning with a silent, lethal fury. The Admiral didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the press. He walked straight down the center aisle, the air humming with the authority of 4 stars. He stopped at the defense table, looked down at the iron bolts anchoring Hannah to the floor, and turned to the judge. "Arthur," Gallagher said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that made the water glasses on the jury's table ripple, "you have exactly 60 seconds to remove those irons before I find a reason to cite this entire proceedings for treason against the United States military. I have a presidential override in my pocket and a very short temper." The silence that followed Admiral Gallagher's entrance was not peaceful. It was the heavy, ionized silence that precedes a lightning strike. In the high-stakes world of military litigation, this was what tactical analysts call a black swan event, an unpredictable occurrence that deviates so far from the norm that it shatters the entire framework of the engagement. As the Admiral stood in the center of the aisle, the 2 U.S. Marshals looked toward Judge Pendleton, their hands hovering near their sidearms, caught in a paralyzing loop of vertical logic. They were trained to obey the judge, but their DNA was programmed to respect the 4 stars on Gallagher's shoulders. "Admiral," Judge Pendleton finally managed to rasp, his voice lacking its earlier bite, "this is a civilian court. Your rank carries no weight here. You are in contempt of this proceeding." "With all due respect, Arthur," Gallagher countered, his voice a low-frequency vibration that seemed to make the mahogany benches hum. "This isn't just a proceeding anymore. It's a cover-up. And as of 0800 hours this morning, this case has been reclassified under the National Security Act, Section 4. This operator belongs to the Navy, and I am here to repossess government property." Hannah Jameson watched the exchange with the same hyper-vigilant detachment she had used to survive the Nasiriyah ambush in 2003. Back then, a confused convoy had taken a wrong turn into a kill box, and she had learned that in the chaos of war, the biggest threat isn't the enemy in front of you, it's the arrogance behind you. As she looked at the Admiral, she saw the horizontal reality finally catching up to the vertical lies. To understand the weight of this moment, look at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. In that disaster, the planners at the top were so convinced of their own brilliance that they ignored the local terrain and the actual strength of the opposition. They sent men into a trap and then pulled the air cover at the last second to save their own political reputations. The CIA was attempting the exact same maneuver with Hannah, using her as the air cover they could discard once the mission went south. The prosecution's lead attorney, David Caldwell, scrambled to the podium, his face a frantic mask of sweat and desperation. "Your Honor, this is a stunt. We have a signed deposition from Gregory Finch at the agency. We have satellite telemetry. We have the evidence." "You have a collection of ghost stories," Gallagher growled, turning his head slowly toward Caldwell. The Admiral's eyes were like depleted uranium, dense, heavy, and lethal. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a single thick folder bound in red top-secret tape. He slammed it onto the defense table. The sound was like a gunshot. "This is the unredacted drone footage from Operation Blackbird," the Admiral announced to the room. "The footage your intelligence assets claimed was lost due to a technical glitch. It turns out the glitch wasn't in the hardware. It was in the ethics of the men running the operation." The room plunged into darkness as the clerk, hands trembling, obeyed the Admiral's command to connect the drive to the gallery monitors. The large 4K screens on the walls flickered to life. The footage wasn't the grainy black and white feed the jury had seen earlier. This was high-definition thermal, the God-eye view that Special Operations relies on for precision targeting. The timestamp read July 14th, 0244 Zulu. The camera zoomed in on a compound on the outskirts of Al Raqqa. The heat signatures were clear. You could see the SEAL team, Bravo platoon, moving in a diamond formation through the shadows of an alleyway. And there, in the center of the compound, was Tariq al-Hassan. But he wasn't acting like a terrified asset. In the unredacted feed, you could clearly see him laughing as he shook hands with a known ISIS-K commander. You could see him pointing toward the very roof where Hannah was positioned. Then the audio kicked in, the ghost track that had been scrubbed from the official record presented by the prosecution. Outlaw 1 to TOC, I have eyes on the asset. He is handing over the extraction codes. He is mining the bridge. I repeat, the bridge is rigged. Requesting immediate neutralization. Permission to engage. The voice of Gregory Finch, the CIA handler, came back over the speakers, cold and dripping with the same arrogance that destroyed the French at Dien Bien Phu. Negative, Outlaw 1. You are experiencing target fixation. Our data overrides your visual. Al-Hassan is performing a tactical deception. Do not compromise the asset. That is a direct order. If you fire that weapon, you will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of military law. On the screen, the tragedy unfolded in slow motion. Al-Hassan began to pull a radio detonator from his pocket. He was looking directly toward the street where the SEAL convoy was about to turn. He wasn't securing the perimeter, he was timing the explosion to maximize the body count of American soldiers. The jury gasped. Several journalists stopped writing, their mouths hanging open. This wasn't a rogue assassin. This was a guardian being told to stand down while her brothers were murdered by a man they were told to protect. Watch her heart rate, the Admiral commanded, pointing to the biometric data streaming on the side of the screen. Hannah's heart rate was a steady 48 beats per minute. Even as her command threatened her with prison, she stayed in the green zone. She waited until the very last second, until Al-Hassan's thumb hovered over the red button that would have vaporized 8 men. Crack! On the screen, Al-Hassan's head snapped back. He dropped instantly. The detonator fell harmlessly into the dust. The bridge remained intact. The team was safe. She didn't disobey an order, Gallagher said, his voice echoing in the absolute silence of the room. She fulfilled the only order that matters. She protected the unit. And for that, this man, he pointed a massive finger at Gregory Finch, who was trying to slip out the back of the room, tried to bury her to hide the fact that he was funding a double agent. The clink of the chains anchoring Hannah to the floor suddenly felt like a crime against the state. The judge looked at the footage, then at the Admiral, then at the red tape folder. The vertical logic of the system had been decapitated by the horizontal reality of the thermal feed. "Bailiff," Judge Pendleton said, his voice barely a whisper, "unlock the secondary restraints, now." As the steel cable was unbolted from the floor, the sound of the metal hitting the wood was the loudest thing in the room. It was the sound of a system admitting it was wrong. But as Hannah shifted her weight, feeling the blood return to her legs, she knew that the Admiral hadn't just come to save her. He had come to start a war. The courtroom, once a theater of absolute control for the prosecution, was now a crime scene. The air was thick with the scent of ozone from the monitors and the sharp metallic tang of cold fear radiating from the government's table. In the world of high-stakes military law, there is a concept known as escalation dominance, the ability to increase the stakes of a conflict so rapidly that the opponent's decision-making cycle collapses. Admiral Gallagher hadn't just entered the room. He had seized the high ground and was now raining down a firestorm of horizontal truth. "Bailiff," Judge Pendleton repeated, his voice gaining a sudden sharp edge of survival instinct. "I said, unlock her, now!" The sound of the key turning in the lock of the secondary restraints was a mechanical click that echoed like a hammer falling on an empty chamber. As the heavy steel cable was pulled through the ring bolt on the floor, Hannah Jameson felt the physical weight of the system's vertical logic lift. But as she stood, the blood rushing back into her hands, she didn't look at the judge. She looked at David Caldwell. The prosecutor was a man whose entire career was built on the arrogance of the map. He was a master of the selective narrative, the art of taking a complex combat engagement and sanitizing it for a jury that had never seen a man bleed. But as he looked at the unredacted thermal feed still flickering on the screens, he realized his map was on fire. He was seeing the same institutional failure that led to the whiskey ring scandals, where the bureaucracy becomes so invested in its own survival that it treats the truth as a hostile combatant. "Your Honor," Caldwell stammered, his hands shaking as he shuffled his notes. The government moves for a stay. We need to verify the source of this footage. This could be a sophisticated deepfake. This could be—" "It's a presidential override, David," Gallagher interrupted, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "The source is the National Security Agency's primary backup server. The server your colleagues at the agency conveniently forgot existed when they issued their subpoena. You didn't just prosecute a Navy SEAL. You attempted to facilitate a judicial execution to cover up a felony. That makes you an accessory after the fact." Narrative note: this is the historical parallel of the Dreyfus Affair in 1894. A French officer was framed for treason not because he was guilty, but because the high command needed a scapegoat to protect their own incompetence. They used forged documents and secret trials, convinced that the honor of the army was more important than the life of an innocent man. But just like in room 402, once the forgery was exposed, the entire structure of the command was revealed as a hollow shell of corruption. Judge Pendleton leaned forward, his eyes burning with a sudden, localized fury. He had been a judge for 30 years, and he realized he had been used as a puppet in a CIA psychological operation. "Mr. Caldwell," Pendleton rasped, the sound like dry leaves skittering over a grave, "the court finds that the prosecution has engaged in a pattern of bad faith non-disclosure. You have presented redacted evidence that was altered to create a false impression of criminal intent. This isn't just a mistrial. This is a subversion of the United States Constitution." The judge slammed his gavel down. The sound was a concussive blast in the silent room. "This case is dismissed with prejudice. Chief Petty Officer Jameson, you are free to go. And if I find that any member of the Department of Justice or the Central Intelligence Agency attempts to harass or detain this operator after she leaves this chamber, I will issue bench warrants for every man in the chain of command." The room erupted. The journalists in the gallery were screaming into their phones. The vertical logic had been decapitated. But Hannah Jameson remained in a green zone of emotional control. She watched as the U.S. Marshals, men who had treated her like a dangerous animal for 90 days, now stepped back, their heads bowed in a silent, shame-filled retreat. But the Admiral wasn't finished. This was the strategic counterstrike. In an serious scenario, surviving the ambush is only phase 1. Phase 2 is the pursuit. You don't let the enemy regroup, you don't let them retreat into the shadows. You hunt them until the threat is neutralized. "Hannah," Gallagher said, stepping toward her. He didn't offer a handshake, he offered her something much more valuable. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was a Navy SEAL trident, the buds pin that had been stripped from her uniform 3 months ago. "The system took this from you," Gallagher said, his voice loud enough for every microphone in the room to catch. "But the system doesn't have the authority to define who you are. Your team defines who you are, and they're waiting for you outside." As Hannah took the pin, the metal cold and sharp against her palm, she looked toward the back of the room. Gregory Finch, the CIA handler who had ordered her to watch her brothers die, was gone. He had vanished during the commotion, retreating into the vertical shadows where men like him feel safe. "He's running, Admiral," Hannah whispered. "Let him run," Gallagher replied, a grim smile touching his lips. "He thinks he's retreating to a safe house. He doesn't realize he's walking into a pre-planned targeted acquisition. We have the unredacted logs, we have the financial signatures, and most importantly, we have the ghost track he thought he deleted. The Admiral turned back to the court. This proceeding is over, but the investigation into the arrogance of command at the Al Raqqa TOC has just begun. We aren't just looking for Finch, we're looking for the men who signed the checks. As Hannah walked out of the courtroom, the survivors of Bravo Platoon formed a phalanx around her. They weren't just protecting her from the press, they were reclaiming their sister. They walked through the marble halls of the courthouse, their boots striking the floor in a synchronized rhythm, the horizontal reality of the unit finally overriding the vertical lies of the institution. Outside, the air of Virginia felt different. It was no longer a chill of stagnant failure, it was the crisp, biting air of a new mission. As Hannah looked at the black SUVs waiting at the curb, she realized that Chapter 3 had ended with her freedom, but Chapter 4 was about the hunt. The arrogant commanders had made a fatal mistake. They thought they could bury a ghost in a courtroom. They forgot that ghosts don't die, they just change their AO. The victory in room 402 was not the end of the war. It was merely the conclusion of a successful counter-ambush. In the high-stakes world of geopolitical chess, when you decapitate a narrative, the body doesn't just fall, it flails. As Chief Petty Officer Hannah Jameson walked out of the Alexandria Federal Courthouse, the heavy steel doors slamming shut behind her with a final echoing boom, she wasn't breathing the air of a free woman. She was breathing the ionized air that lingers after a massive electrical discharge. She was free from the physical chains, but she was now firmly in the crosshairs of an even larger, more desperate machine. To understand the danger Hannah faced in the immediate aftermath, one must look at the historical parallel of the Church Committee hearings in the 1970s. When the veil was finally lifted on the intelligence community's extra-legal operations, the reaction from the shadows wasn't an apology, it was a scorched earth defense. They didn't just hide the files, they attempted to destroy the credibility of the people who found them. This is the vertical logic of survival. When the map is proven wrong, the bureaucracy doesn't redraw the map, it tries to kill the surveyor. The convoy of blacked-out SUVs waiting at the curb wasn't for the press, it was a tactical extraction team. Admiral Gallagher pushed through the swarm of reporters like a lead sled through fresh snow, his hand firmly on Hannah's shoulder. They weren't heading to a luxury hotel or victory party. They were heading to the Vault, a secure compartmented information facility, SCIF, buried deep within the bedrock of the Pentagon. The dismissal was the easy part, Chief, Gallagher growled as the SUV pulled into the chaotic Virginia traffic, flanked by 4 outriders on motorcycles. But you didn't just beat a court case, you exposed a multi-billion-dollar black-budget pipeline that the agency has been using to fund local militias like Al-Hassan's since the 2011 surge. You didn't just shoot a traitor, you shot a hole in their secret ledger. And men like Gregory Finch don't go to jail, they go to ground. Hannah looked down at her wrists. The skin was raw, a deep, angry red where the iron had bitten in for 90 days. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a soldier who had survived a Dien Bien Phu, only to find out the war had moved from the jungle to her own backyard. She thought of Nasiriyah in 2003, the chaos of the 507th Maintenance Company. Back then, the failure was one of logistics and navigation. Today, the failure was one of morality and command arrogance. "Where's Finch, Admiral?" Hannah asked, her voice raspy from months of near silence. "Finch is a ghost," Admiral replied, his eyes fixed on the secure tablet in his lap. "The agency extracted him from NCIS custody 20 minutes after the judge dismissed the charges. They claimed operational necessity under an executive order from 1981. In reality, they're scrubbing him. If he talks, the entire Middle East desk collapses. They'll either put him in a hole in Langley or put him in a grave in the Potomac." Inside the Pentagon's skiff, the atmosphere was one of operational readiness. The walls were lined with monitors displaying real-time satellite telemetry and encrypted data streams. The survivors of Bravo platoon were already there, stripped of their dress uniforms and back in their tactical gear. They didn't need orders. They were already hunting. The ghost track audio we played in court was only the first half, the Admiral said, signaling the technician to override the encryption. The second half is what Finch tried to delete permanently. He didn't just order you to stand down, Hannah. He was coordinating with the enemy in real time. The audio kicked in. The ghost track, raw feed. TOC, this is Outlaw 1. I have positive ID on Finch's signature on the encrypted radio channel. He's talking to the insurgents. He's giving them our grid coordinates. I repeat, the handler is the leak. He's walking the team into a kill box. Hannah stood frozen as she heard her own voice from 3 months ago. The courtroom hadn't heard this part. The Admiral had kept this piece of the puzzle close to his chest, a reserve force for the final engagement. It was a classic double-blind play. They didn't just try to frame you for murder, Hannah, Gallagher said, leaning over the console. They tried to murder you in Al Raqqa. Finch wasn't protecting a national asset. He was protecting a business arrangement. He had been selling our troop movements to the highest bidder for 18 months. You didn't just disrupt an ambush, you disrupted a billion-dollar business model. This was the ultimate historical circle. From the whiskey ring scandals of the 1870s to the Iran-Contra affair of the 1880s, the pattern is always the same. The people at the top begin to believe they are the state. They begin to believe that the rules of engagement are for the common soldier, while they operate in a vacuum of accountability. They become the arrogant commanders who view their troops as expendable pawns in a game of global chess. I want my trident back, Hannah said, her eyes burning with a cold blue fire that made the technician pull back. And I want the men who signed the checks for Al-Hassan to see my face before they go to prison. Gallagher nodded. That's why we're here. We aren't just filing a report. We're launching a targeted acquisition. We have the unredacted logs, we have the financial signatures, and more importantly, we have the biometric signatures of every man in that TOC. But Finch made a mistake. He's still using an encrypted agency burner. He thinks the vertical logic of the CIA will protect him. He doesn't realize we've already tapped into the satellite backbone. He's heading for a private airfield in Manassas, Master Chief Miller said, pointing to a pulsing red dot on the map. Tail number N442 Zulu. It's an agency front company. They're going to fly him to a black site in Eastern Europe where he'll be untouchable. Not on my watch, Hannah whispered. This was the strategic turning point. In an Assyria scenario, surviving the ambush is only Phase 1. Phase 2 is the pursuit. You don't let the enemy regroup. You don't let them retreat into the shadows of vertical logic. You hunt them until the threat is neutralized at the source. As Hannah reached for a suppressed Sig Sauer on the armory table, she realized her battle hadn't ended in room 402. It had simply changed terrain. She was no longer the target. She was the ghost on the high ground. The arrogant commanders thought they could bury a SEAL in a courtroom. They forgot that when you try to bury a warrior, you're just giving them a place to hide before they strike back. The pursuit was no longer a matter of law. It was a matter of kinetic accountability. In the world of high-stakes intelligence, there is a phenomenon known as the Scorched Earth Protocol, a desperate maneuver used by failing bureaucracies to incinerate any evidence or any person that threatens the structural integrity of the vertical logic. As the black SUVs tore through the Virginia night toward Manassas, Hannah Jameson wasn't just chasing a man, she was chasing the physical manifestation of a decade of institutional rot. To understand the atmosphere of this hunt, one must look at the historical parallel of the Phoenix program during the Vietnam War. It was a system designed to neutralize the shadow government of the enemy, but it eventually devolved into a mechanism for settling internal scores and burying inconvenient truths. The men in the charcoal suits at Langley weren't trying to protect America anymore. They were trying to protect the phoenix they had built in the Middle East, a phoenix that Gregory Finch had turned into a personal ATM. Manassas Regional Airfield was a patchwork of shadows and expensive aluminum. Private hangars stood like silent monoliths under the flickering orange glow of sodium vapor lights. This was the low-signature world of the CIA's front companies, a place where tail numbers were changed like aliases and flight plans were filed with national security exemptions. N442 Zulu is on the taxiway. Master Chief Miller's voice crackled over the comms. He was positioned on a water tower 300 yards out, his eyes locked into the thermal optic of his Mark 11. I have visual on Finch. He's escorted by 4 Tier 2 contractors. They're carrying subguns. This isn't an extraction, it's a high-threat exfiltration. Hannah sat in the back of the lead SUV, her fingers moving with mechanical precision as she checked the chamber of her suppressed Sig Sauer. She felt the Nasiriyah ghosts rising again. In 2003, the ambush happened because the command was blind. Tonight, the ambush was reversed because the ghosts had the high ground. Admiral, we are 30 seconds out. Hannah's voice was a flat, lethal monotone, requesting permission to initiate strategic interdiction. Permission granted, Outlaw 1. Gallagher's voice came through, heavy with the weight of the stars on his shoulders. But remember, Finch is the ledger. We need him alive long enough to unlock the encrypted accounts. If he reaches that Gulf Stream, the trail goes cold in a black site in Bucharest. Don't let him hit the ramp. The SUV didn't slow down for the perimeter fence. It hit the chain link at 60 miles per hour, a tactical breach and clear that caught the agency contractors completely off guard. This was the horizontal reality hitting the vertical plan. The contractors had been briefed that they were protecting a VIP from unauthorized military elements. They weren't prepared for a Tier 1 SEAL team. Hannah rolled out of the moving vehicle before it even came to a complete stop. She didn't move like a woman who had been in chains for 90 days. She moved like a predator returning to its natural habitat. The first contractor raised his MP5, his vertical logic telling him that his badge and his agency status made him untouchable. Thwip, thwip. 2 subsonic rounds from Hannah's SIG took him in the center of his plate and the base of his throat. He went down without a sound. This was the anatomy of the shot. It wasn't about anger. It was about the cold, mathematical removal of an obstacle. "Finch is breaking for the stairs," Miller shouted over the radio. Hannah didn't run. She moved in a tactical glide, her weapon transitioning from target to target. She saw Finch, a man who had spent his life in climate-controlled offices, deciding which soldiers would live or die based on a spreadsheet. He looked small now. He looked terrified. He was realizing that the arrogance of the map provides no cover when the ghost is in the room. "Stay back!" Finch screamed, his voice cracking as he reached the bottom of the Gulf Stream stairs. He pulled a heavy, encrypted laptop from his bag and held it over the edge of the fuel-soaked tarmac. "I'll wipe the drive. Every account, every name, every black project from Kabul to Cairo, gone in one keystroke. You'll never get your trident back, Jameson. You'll just be the woman who died for nothing." Hannah stopped 10 feet from him. The wind from the Gulf Stream's idling engines whipped her hair across her face, but her eyes never left Finch's thumb. He was hovering over the emergency wipe key. This was his last piece of vertical logic, the belief that information was a shield that could stop a bullet. "You think the trident is a piece of metal, Gregory?" Hannah asked, her voice carrying over the whine of the turbines. "You think my life is defined by a folder in Langley?" "It's all you have," Finch shrieked. "Without me, you're a criminal. I'm the only one who can tell them you were following orders." "That's where you're wrong," Hannah said, taking a step forward. "I wasn't following your orders. I was following the only order that matters. And as for the drive, she tilted her head toward the water tower, you're in a negative displacement zone. My Master Chief has had a laser link on that laptop since you stepped out of the hangar. If you even twitch that thumb, he doesn't hit you, he hits the battery housing of that computer. The drive stays, but you lose your hand. Finch looked up at the dark horizon, his face a mask of sweating, agonizing realization. He had spent his career believing that the best and the brightest could control the world from a distance. He had forgotten the lesson of Dien Bien Phu. The moment you lose the high ground to a man who is willing to die for it, your maps are worthless. Drop the laptop, Gregory, Hannah commanded, and give me the codes, or we can do this the horizontal way. And I promise you, the horizontal way involves a lot more blood than you're used to seeing in a PowerPoint. Finch's thumb shook. He looked at the Gulf Stream, his ticket to a life of luxury on stolen blood money, and then at the cold, winter ice eyes of the woman he had tried to bury. The vertical logic of the CIA finally shattered. He let a laptop slide from his fingers. It hit the tarmac with a dull thud. Hannah didn't wait for him to surrender. She moved in, her knee hitting his chest with the force of a decade of betrayal. She drove him into the ground, the very same way the system had driven her into the courthouse floor. But as she clicked the handcuffs onto his wrists, the very same cuffs she had worn for 3 months, she whispered into his ear, "It's over, Gregory. The map is gone. Welcome to the ground." The victory at the Manassas airfield was not celebrated with fanfare or parades. In the world of Tier 1 operators, true success is measured by the silence that follows the storm. As the sun began to bleed over the Potomac River, painting the Virginia sky in shades of bruised purple and deep crimson, the vertical logic of the agency was finally being dismantled by the weight of its own corruption. The scorched earth protocol had failed because the ghosts had moved faster than the fire. To understand the magnitude of this final reckoning, one must look at the historical parallel of the Nuremberg trials after World War II. For the first time, the world established that following orders was not a shield for moral bankruptcy. In the military, the chain of command is sacred, but it is not a suicide pact. When the commanders at the top become the architects of betrayal, the soldier on the ground has a duty to the truth that transcends their rank. Hannah Jameson had not just defended herself, she had defended the very soul of the service. 1 week later, the setting was the Pacific Coast, Coronado, California. The air was thick with the scent of salt spray and the rhythmic, thunderous roar of the surf hitting the beach at the Naval Special Warfare Center. This was the birthplace of the SEALs, the ground where the vertical logic of the civilian world is stripped away and replaced by the horizontal reality of the team. There were no cameras, there were no whispering journalists or arrogant prosecutors. There were only 30 men in dress blues, their faces hardened by a decade of constant conflict, standing in a perfect, rigid formation on the sand. In the center stood Admiral Robert Bull Gallagher. He looked at the horizon, where the Pacific was a flat gray sheet of glass, and then he looked at Chief Petty Officer Hannah Jameson. In 1953, at Dien Bien Phu, Gallagher began, his voice carrying over the wind like a low-frequency broadcast. The French commanders lost because they didn't believe the enemy could reach the high ground. In 2003, at Nasiriyah, our own commanders lost because they didn't believe the map could be wrong. But today, we are standing here because one operator refused to believe the lie. He stepped toward Hannah. She was back in her dress whites, but this time they weren't the ICE uniform of a defendant. They were the armor of a reclaimed legend. The raw wounds on her wrists from the handcuffs had begun to fade into thin, silver scars, permanent reminders of the 90 days the system tried to break her. "The agency tried to redact your life, Chief," Gallagher said, reaching into a small wooden box held by Master Chief Miller. "They tried to turn your integrity into a crime. But the arrogance of the map always fails when it meets the reality of the ground. With a steady hand, the Admiral pinned the golden trident back onto Hannah's chest. The metal caught the morning sun, a brilliant flash of gold against the white fabric. It was the return of the ghost. As the trident was pinned 5,000 miles away, the vertical structure was collapsing. The laptop Hannah had recovered at Manassas had acted as a digital Trojan horse. The ghost track audio, combined with the financial ledgers of Gregory Finch, had triggered a systemic purge. The director of the Middle East desk had been forced into early retirement. Gregory Finch was no longer a ghost. He was a resident of a maximum security federal wing, facing charges of treason and conspiracy to commit murder. The black budget pipeline that had funded the betrayal in Al Raqqa was being dismantled dollar by dollar by a Senate oversight committee that could no longer ignore the blood on the ledger. But for Hannah, the victory wasn't in the headlines. It was in the eyes of the 8 men standing in the front row of the formation, the men of Bravo Platoon. They didn't need a Senate report to tell them who she was. They knew that when the maps lied and the radios went silent, she was the one who held the high ground. She was the one who chose the horizontal truth of her brothers over the vertical safety of her career. The ceremony ended as quietly as it began. The men dispersed, leaving Hannah alone on the beach. She looked out at the water, the same water she had crawled through during Hell Week years ago. She realized that the arrogant commanders would always be there. There would always be men like Finch who believe that the world is a game of chess played from 30,000 feet. There would always be maps that ignore the mountains. But as long as there are ghosts who are willing to pull the trigger on a lie, the unit will survive. The handcuffed sniper was no longer a victim of the system. She was its conscience. As she turned to walk away from the surf, the golden trident heavy on her chest, Hannah Jameson knew that the war for the soul of the military would never truly be over. But she also knew that she was ready for the next mission. Because the high ground doesn't belong to the man with the map. It belongs to the soldier who is willing to take it. History is a circle for those who ignore it, but it is a ladder for those who have the courage to climb. From the crumbling bunkers of Dien Bien Phu to the treacherous streets of Nasiriyah and the modern courtrooms of Virginia, the cost of arrogance is always paid by the soldier on the ground. When the people at the top value the strategic asset over the human life, the system fails. Hannah Jameson survived the courtroom, she survived the desert, and she survived the betrayal of her own command to prove that the truth is the only thing that can't be redacted. If you believe our warriors deserve leaders who lead with integrity instead of spreadsheets, then hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring these stories out of the shadows and into the light. And we want to hear from you in the comments. Do you believe the arrogance of the map is still the biggest threat to our troops today, or has the system finally learned its lesson?